I'm Shelly Banjo. I'm our New York bureau chief at Bloomberg News, and I am here with Canada's Chief Trade Commissioner, Sara Wilshaw. Sara, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great honor to be with you today.
Let's jump right into the global economy. You have a very interesting kind of viewpoint, your finger on the pulse of what's important to Canadian exporters. What are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you're hearing and seeing in the global economy right now?
You know, there's a lot that's been happening in the last little while. You can imagine a lot of things have come out of the pandemic that we've been going through for the past couple of years. Now we've got a war in Europe happening, and a lot of uncertainty, frankly. So we see and hear most about supply constraints, uncertainty, geopolitical developments, and a kind of a tendency towards protectionism in some really important markets. Those are the three concerns that are most frequently raised. Of course, there are others, but those come up a lot. And while the general sort of trend has remained pretty resilient in the face of those challenges, there are some pressure points that raise specific concerns for businesses that operate globally. So within that new environment that we're kind of navigating, I think what we want to do on our side is try to foster as much diversity of the export markets and build resiliency into our supply chains. And we do that in a number of ways. If you allow me to just talk about that a little bit. We're trying to build upon our existing trading relationships and develop new partnerships in really critical areas. So think about diversity for us, meaning also providing international opportunities for businesses in an economy that is increasingly green and increasingly digital. So our trade negotiators, for example, have been trying to modernize our toolkit, adding things like trade and gender chapters, e-commerce chapters, SME chapters, in addition to the sort of labor and environment agreements that we've been including in our FTAs for some time already. And given our dependency on trade, that's pretty critical for Canada. So I think we're really well positioned to respond to the challenges that are out there. But we're very cognizant of the fact that the Canadian industry and a lot of industries around the world made up of small and medium-sized companies, and their challenges are things like access to capital, mentors, networks abroad, and that's where really my team, along with our fantastic partners at all levels of government here, we've got Export Development Canada, Business Development Canada, many partners in the provinces and territories, and we have all kinds of programs where we work together to create mentor networks, tech accelerators, export financing, and we're really trying to be the eyes and ears on the ground for these businesses across the world. So that's a little bit about what my team does, and we're 1,000 people. We're located in 160 locations around the world, and we're continuously in contact with the businesses and the associations and all kinds of stakeholders to try and really help our clients to know what's happening out there, what the opportunities are, and then how to navigate some of those challenges.
You mentioned the supply chain. How much more important is the reliability factor these days compared to maybe, say, 10 years ago, where the whole focus was on just in time?
Absolutely. And those supply chains have been building over decades, right? Like a lot of opportunity for folks to really take advantage of the specialization that certain countries and certain businesses can offer. And they've been working together, and as you say, on just in time. And increasingly, I think companies are worried. They're worried about whether they're going to be able to get their inputs in time, whether they're going to be able to make deliveries, and so on. So there's a lot going on in that space, and I think folks, like every country around the world, Canada is no exception, is really looking at whether the disruptions caused by the pandemic or by what's happening in Europe, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, or any other disruptions, climate change as well, right? If you think about how that's affecting or will affect the movement of goods and people are thinking about these things, and we're trying to figure out ways to create that resilience, right? And there's a number of ways to do that. Diversification is one of them, of course. but there are much broader systemic challenges that we're really trying to address through cooperation amongst countries. So the government of Canada is working on, with a lot of other nations to really strengthen the rules-based system that underpins our trading relationships, but also to promote Canada as a trusted partner and an attractive source for supply chain input. So now and in the future, and if you think about some of that future economy, digital or green economy in particular, we've got all the inputs and all the ingredients necessary here to be a really important player in that space. And so we want to play on top of that, but also work with a lot of partners who can bring technical know-how into the country and help us to move forward together. So this is all kind of part and parcel of that. But on the trust factor, there's just one thing I'd like to add there too, because it's really important how our reputation underpins our relationships as well. And it extends to how our businesses operate internationally. And we've got a new responsible business conduct strategy that has been recently launched, and it sets out clear expectations for how Canadian businesses should be engaging internationally, as well as offering a range of advice and guidance and supports to those efforts. But there's a lot going on in this space for sure.
You mentioned the Ukraine war. Obviously, there was a ton of dislocation right when it began. But we recently hosted the UN General Assembly meetings here in New York, and an executive said to me, "You thought there was an issue now. Think about what it's going to do to energy and other areas a year from now." And I'm kind of curious as to your planning there and what you've been hearing from businesses, from Canadian businesses about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that I think there's a lot of concern. A lot of it rests on how long do we think that this conflict is going to last as well. But there's no doubt that some of these disruptions that have taken place and some of the concerns about food security, energy security, as well as what might be in our future with climate change. People are thinking about where they're vulnerable. Countries and companies are all thinking about where their vulnerabilities lie, and then how can we set up systems and structures that help us to navigate those? What's critical within what is determined to be vulnerable, and how can we sort of create partnerships that can be trusted, as I said, and build connections that will help us to navigate those channels. So, thinking about where Canada is, I mean, we're the beneficiaries probably of some of the rises in prices, where it concerns energy and where it concerns food production and some other critical inputs. But at the same time, we recognize that our businesses are also trying to bring inputs into Canada, and so everybody's trying to navigate this. Everybody's trying to figure out what it will mean, whether it will last a long time, or what can we do to make sure that we're going on the right path forward. And that's just getting more participation, I think, in global markets. So we want to see more people participating, and particularly underrepresented exporters, for example. So women-owned businesses, Indigenous-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, and so on, getting more involved in international marketplaces, and creating opportunities for that to happen at the same time as helping to de-risk some of those markets. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about that. And there are all kinds of new channels to explore, and things that help to kind of reduce some of those disruptive factors. But it's definitely a real concern out there.
The other big issue, I think, on everyone's minds globally is inflation. How are you guys kind of planning around that in the year ahead? Is it impacting any of your estimates for the year ahead, or is it changing the way that you're thinking about things?
There again, I would say It depends how long you think which economist you're listening to. It will tell you how long you think that we are going to be experiencing high inflation and what exactly is the recipe for trying to bring it down. And I think every central banker is also having the same kind of conversation about, what is the right mix policies and programs that will help to ease that inflationary pressure, and make things a little easier for consumers and for international business development and trade. Right. So it's definitely not easy. It's definitely difficult to predict trends. I think for those of us like the economists that we work with, for example, to try and understand the true economic and trade performance because of the strong increases in the value of trade flows, reflecting rising prices, but it can mask those sort of true gains in real economic activity, and that's tough, particularly for a resource-rich nation like Canada. So, as I said, we've benefited from increases in prices in energy and resources and agricultural exports, but we know that really is only part of the story. So I think for us, an important objective is to try and restore some stability in this environment, and that's a challenge certainly for all other governments, and we're no exception. But for my part, and what my team does, we're really trying to make international trade less uncertain, less risky, and just a little easier by helping to remove the barriers to trade through things like trade agreements, and then also to help people really understand what's happening on the ground with our global network.
One good thing is that we're sort of moving away from a lot of the pandemic restrictions. Has that changed the nature of some of the FDI trends that you're seeing? And also about your earlier comment about the trade agreements, you guys have a number of these trade agreements with all the G7 countries. Has that also kind of, changed the calculus for you guys as well?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think everybody saw global FDI flows drop off pretty sharply in 2020. In Canada, they dropped by 49%. Travel severely restricted, of course, though, if not impossible in some cases. So you can imagine few businesses are going to be willing to make significant investments sight unseen without some kind of, face-to-face or on-site activity. So you can imagine that's why those things dropped off, but actually they've really had a big bounce. And part of that, I think, is, a pent up sort of demand. And that, that's also affecting the supply chain piece too, right? Is that stuff coming back really quickly, that demand coming back. I think we're seeing the deal flow begin again. And in fact, last year, Canada's FDI stock rose above pre-pandemic levels, reaching 1.1 trillion. This was, this is almost 8% above the previous year, and so that's pretty amazing. And then in terms of the FTAs, Canada is and always has been and probably always will be a trading nation. 2/3 of our GDP depends on trade, so our economy is subject to and affected by all economic disruptions and all kinds of things that happen beyond our borders. So we do everything we can to kind of mitigate those risks. And part of that is creating those FTA relationships. And we're the first G7 country to have trade agreements in place with every other G7 nation. We're also a party to 15 free trade agreements around the world, giving access to, or preferential access, I should say, to 1.5 billion people. And that puts our companies, I think, in a very enviable position. And we really try to use those tools. We're continuing to negotiate more free trade agreements, but what we need are people to use them. So they need to understand how to use them and use them to their best advantage on both sides, really, so that we can see those flows, both FDI and imports and exports, increase and really help build those foundations.